Hello and welcome to episode 194 of the Chills of Will podcast. Pleasure today to be joined by Ruth Madievsky. Ruth is the author of a novel, All Night Pharmacy. It's not just a novel, it's a great novel to be the main focus of our conversation today. It came out, I want to say July 11th, is that correct?
Hmm.
It was an instant national bestseller. An indie next pick, All Night Pharmacy has been named a best or most anticipated 2023 book by over 40 venues, including NPR, the Los Angeles Times, Vanity Fair, Vogue, Vulture, and Buzzfeed. Ruth's writing appears in The Atlantic, the Los Angeles Times, Harper's Bazaar, Them, Plowshares, Tin House, and elsewhere. She is the author of a poetry collection, Emergency Break, and a Tin House Summer Writers Workshop scholar. She co-founded the Cheburashka Collective, which is a community of women and non-binary writers whose identity has been shaped by immigration from the Soviet Union to the United States. Originally from Moldova, she lives in Los Angeles, where she works as an HIV and primary care pharmacist. You can find her at www.ruthmadievsky, MADIEVSKY.com, www.ruthmadievsky.com, and on social media at first name, last name, Ruth Madievsky. Thanks so much for joining me today. How are you?
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, congrats on two, at least two huge milestones. One was with the 14-week-old Aria. Congratulations.
Thank you
And
so much.
I'm sure you're getting all kinds of sleep all the time, and you're just fresh and energetic, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. The fragmented sleep for months on that is doing wonders for. Yeah, it's so funny. People used to say that I look much younger than my age. Like people would think that I like was still a teenager when I was in my late 20s, and now nobody ever says that anymore.
Well, and also congrats on, of course, on All Night Pharmacy. It's I mean, it's been blowing up. It's USA Today, you're on NPR recently, LA Times. How does it feel with juggling these two huge milestones in your life?
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's been incredible, and I feel very, very grateful that readers have found the book because I am normally a really big hustler. I very much have that like immigrant mentality of like
Mm.
being prepared to do whatever it takes. But with having a newborn, I really haven't been able to pitch a lot of, essays and stuff. And I've done everything I've said I would do, like contractually with like essays and reading lists I've agreed to write, but I haven't really been um, doing as much hustling as I thought I would for my first book.
Mm.
And I'm just like so grateful that I have an amazing team at Catapult who's been getting it into readers' hands and that, booksellers, librarians, early readers, people have been spreading the word because
Yeah.
there's definitely a scenario in which like the book came out and like because of my own failings to do as much as I wanted to do, like it might not have found its people. So I'm
Huh.
very grateful.
So is Catapult like an imprint of Penguin Random House?
So they're an independent press, but they're distributed by Penguin Random House. So
Okay.
they have the power of that distribution network. We have amazing reps who help get it into bookstores and libraries. So it's a nice melding of them having their own kind of unique taste and being able to take chances on books that are maybe a little less like obviously commercial,
Hmm.
but they have that amazing distribution network.
Yeah. Well, dang, my local library had like a 13, 14 person wait list already.
Oh, cool! That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah. So I wonder, shout out any maybe local bookstores or ways to get the book. I know it's available everywhere, but what are some recommendations for where to buy it, how to buy it?
My favorite bookstore in LA is Skylight Books. That's where I
Yeah.
had my launch. That's where I got engaged. They
Okay.
have this beautiful ficus tree in the middle of the bookstore. Um, so that's a great place to get it. Book Soup in West Hollywood is also great. I'm doing an event
Mhm.
there in August with Alexander Chang, who has a short story collection coming out called Tomb Sweeping that I'm so excited to read.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I'd love to know about growing up. You talked about Hollywood and the book. A lot of the book is set in, I want to say, East Hollywood,
Yeah. Yeah,
right?
kind of like Silver Lake Echo Park area.
Uh-huh. Yes, yes, yes. Don't call it the East Side, right? People get pretty up in arms about that in LA. But I just wonder about growing up. I know that you were born in Moldova, and I wonder,
Hmm.
maybe about language. I'm always so in doing a lot of research on Moldova, and I think of one of my former students from there, like, is Romanian the official language? Is that what you
So
grew up speaking? I'd love to know about that.
yeah, so my family grew up speaking Russian
Okay.
because of like kind of the effects of Russification, imperialism in the Soviet Union. Other languages that were not Russian were heavily suppressed during that time.
Okay.
So my family grew up speaking Russian. I don't speak any Romanian. And
Mm.
the Moldovan language and Romanian language are very, very similar. I think there's like a lot of controversy over whether they're different languages or not, so I won't wade into that.
Okay.
But yeah, even though my mom's side is from Moldova, my dad's side is from Ukraine, we're not really considered Moldovan or Ukrainian because we're Jewish. And,
Uh-huh.
at the time that was kind of a disqualifying thing, is
Uh-huh.
that if you're Jewish, you don't get to belong to any national identities. So that's kind of something I was interested in also as I was writing the book, and as this like genocidal war has broken out in Ukraine, is just, what are we? We speak Russian, but we're not Russian. We're from Moldova and Ukraine, but we're not Moldovan or Ukrainian.
Yeah. Well, so when you moved, I would guess maybe in the, being that you're what, 25 years old, so probably what,
Oh,
19
that's flattering. I'm 31.
in like the 90s or 2000, like I think of
Yeah,
like
93.
okay, like Mila Kunis, and like very very little Jewish population left, right, in Moldova, for example. Is that like, I mean, does that go all the way back to like the pogroms of like the early 1900s? Has that been a gradual process? Was there something about the breaking up of the Soviet Union that led to a lot more immigration or emigration?
Yeah, so there was actually a pogrom in Chisinau, which is where I'm from, in Moldova. It's the capital. And so, a lot of Jews were killed, and also a lot of us left as political refugees. So that's how my family got out, as we came as Jewish refugees in the 93. So yeah, after the Soviet Union fell, there was kind of a huge flooding of people out of the region. And at very similar times of the year, which is interesting, like in the
Mm.
Chibrasha Collective, which is my kind of loose community of other post-Soviet writers.
Mm.
Um, no one else in the collective, I think, is from Chisinau, but there's people from Ukraine, from Russia, from other places in the former Soviet Union. And some of us literally immigrate on the exact same day, like November 16th. Like a lot of us
Wow.
might have even been on the same, flight or in the airport at the same time. Kind of
Oh my God.
interesting.
Wow. So tell me about growing up in LA, and I mean, were you able to find, I mean, I know that there's a big Russian population in LA. There's a big Russian Jewish
Mm-hmm.
population in LA. I wonder about finding kind of your people, if you will. And that doesn't just mean literal, that means like finding your fellow writers, readers, and kind of how language was treated in your house. I mean, was it a big oral stories family? Were you, in the library, 5 times a week? How did that work?
Both.
Yeah.
So we spoke Russian at home growing up because my family really, really wanted me to be able to speak Russian and be able to read it, be able to write it. And, to their credit, I do, even though it was often annoying when I was younger, that my parents would often kind of snap, like, speak Russian, speak Russian. Um, I'm grateful for it because even now my Russian is still pretty kind of elementary school level. And in fact, that's kind of flattering because I've hung out with some like 4 and 5 year olds who can speak much more eloquently than me, like truly. Like the conjugation is nothing to feel jealous about on my end. But so I grew up speaking mostly Russian, um, and learned how to read and write in Russian, which I can do, but slowly. I
Mm,
took a couple Russian for native speakers classes in college, and that was helpful because that
mm,
was like the first time I ever had books learning. Because I have a lot of deficits in my language around things that I never would have heard around the house.
sure.
So, for example, my dad's mom is, kind of an intelligentsia. She has a
Mm,
very sophisticated command of the language, and I often have no idea what she's talking about and have to
mm,
ask her to really dumb it down for me.
yeah.
Because the big words she uses that I wouldn't have heard around the house are just totally above what I can handle. Um,
When you took it in college, I mean, was it like riding a bike? I mean, did you feel like boom, it came back in many
It
ways?
did. It's a funny thing. And when I went to Moldova and Russia for the first and only time since I immigrated in 2019, so
Mm,
before COVID and before the war broke out, just from being there for 2 weeks and speaking a lot of Russian, I felt my language getting better.
mm,
And we went over my mom's birthday, and I was able to give like a 2-minute toast in Russian,
yay.
which I would struggle with now, um,
Mhm,
without having to like substitute in a bunch of English words, hoping that people understand.
sure.
But to answer your question about community, we moved to the West Hollywood area, which is very much a Soviet diaspora area, kind of Santa Monica and Fairfax, where,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of restaurants and stores, like pharmacies, that have names in Russian, like apteka instead of pharmacy.
Mm.
At my elementary school, most kids there were Russian speaking. And we had just found a really tight-knit immigrant community there. So I've grown up surrounded by Russian speakers and people from the Soviet diaspora.
Mm.
So that was never something I had to go searching for. Although finding writers from the former Soviet Union, that was something that I did find online in more recent years with the Chibarashka Collective,
Yeah.
because that wasn't something that I had built in. And that was kind of a revelation, especially to see people who were, queer and non-binary and, much more politically left than
Mm.
the post-Soviet community tends to be.
Mm.
That was like incredible.
So when you translate the book into Russian, uptika all night? I don't know how you say that, but
Huh? Oh, good question. How do I do that? Let's see. Um, oh my God, see, I feel like I don't even know how to do it
I'm putting you on the
succinctly.
spot.
I,
Don't
I would
worry.
I would say like pharmacists open all night, like аптека, которая открыта всю ночь. But that's like not pithy at all.
I said
Or
not
вся
pithy.
ночная аптека, maybe, but I feel like that's not even that right. So kind of case in point.
My first teaching job was at Third and La Brea, so
Love it.
pretty dang close to the Fairfax
Yeah.
area. Definitely, yeah, yeah. It was technically Hancock Park, I guess,
Hmm.
but not too far at all from West Hollywood.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, stone's throw.
definitely. It was ironically in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood, but it's a Catholic school,
That'll do it.
right?
Yeah, LA is really interesting like that.
Oh, so interesting. Miss it. I miss it. Sorry, I won't cry on. I won't cry on. How about the reading and writing part? I mean, was that something where your English was the speed was it was sped up much more just by doing reading? Was that something kind of like self-prescribed? Did you have those wonderful teachers who put you on to, Maya Angelou or
Mm,
Babysitter's Club? I don't know what were you reading in those days?
interesting. Yeah, I mean, I've always loved to read from a really young age. I did take ESL classes in elementary school, and there's just these like hilarious pictures where it's like me and like my friend from India, my friend from China, and we're all just like sitting there with our plastered on smiles, holding up signs that say like orange, like just looking so like new to America. It's like beautiful melting pot in Cincinnati, Ohio, where we briefly lived for a few years,
Uh-huh.
because my dad was doing his medical residency there. Um, so I've always loved to read from a young age, and you know, Soviet culture is very literature heavy. It's that people grow up memorizing poems that they can still recite, and
Mhm.
um, there's a strong literary tradition there. So I've always had people reading to me. I've always loved to read, and at some point, I think in middle school, that translated into a love of writing. And I mean, I think I read kind of all the standard things that people loved. Like I definitely read Babysitter's Little Sisters. I love the Wayside School series, A Series of
Mm.
Unfortunate Events.
Yeah.
Eventually, Harry Potter, and then um, I was lucky that in middle and high school, I had really great English teachers who totally nurtured my love of creative writing and reading. And um, eventually in college, I became friends with other people who were writing very seriously.
Hmm.
So even people in college who were sending their work out for publication, working on books, which
Mhm.
was a world I totally didn't know at all. I kind of thought that if you want to be a writer, you either never publish anything or you publish a book and make millions of dollars, and there was kind of no in between. So
Hmm.
I'm very grateful that I met my creative writing community in college and realized like what that world actually looks like, because I
Yeah.
was not doing the research on my own.
I wonder how LA or Hollywood has kind of like become a character in your work, or just influence you. I mean, people think of like Hollywood and Vine, but Hollywood, like East Hollywood, I want to say is like Thai and
Yeah, very, very
Salvadoran.
different vibe than Hollywood, which is
Right.
so kind of like touristy and often yucky.
Yeah. Did you feel like, did you grow up with, you know, celebrities? Did you grow up with the immigrant world, all of the above? Like, did you feel close to that Hollywood image?
It's so funny. Growing up in LA, one of the things I love about it is it's such a contradictory, complicated
Hmm.
city, right? Like,
Yes.
it's the kind of city where I've dined in the same restaurant as Jonah Hill like two or three times.
Nice.
But it's also like just so it has these areas that are you can see the gentrification happening in real time, which is something I was interested in writing about. Like in East Hollywood specifically, you have these like bougie coffee shops and restaurants, but you also have these like old dive bars, and it's really expensive to live there now, but a lot of the houses and apartments are very old and, might not have air conditioning. And, you'll venture downtown and you'll be around these like, Zagat rated top restaurants, which are truly one block from Skid Row. And you have to, step around someone who's actively having, a mental health crisis right next to you to get into your like 300-person waitlist restaurant.
Right. So, who really were those formational, transformational writers or books or works? And then, I mean, we haven't really talked about it yet. You're a poet as well. It's not like, you just prose. So who were some of the writers who just awed you and it was like, I want to do this, and also I can never do this. They're too dang good.
Yeah, that is kind of the feeling, is that just like cowering in shame and how you'll never be as good as the writers you look up to, which is also motivating for me. Yeah, I mean, my love affair with the written word, a lot of it started with poetry. So people like Richard Seikin, Marie Howe, Terrence Hayes, writers whose command of the language and is so arresting and specific. The specificity is what's of the image is often what really gets me. So people whose works are full of not just trees, but poplar trees. It's not food, it's double cheeseburgers, it's cough drops and IV bags and things that are like really specific that capture how it feels to be alive. That's the kind of poetry I love to read and what I ended up writing. And with fiction, I'm very into voice. So people like Dennis Johnson, Otessa Moshfegh, Brian Washington, Raven Leilani, people where you just get kind of swept away by the narration, and you just feel like that book is written by a real person, and you feel like the characters are so tangible. Voice is always what draws me in, and that's the kind of book I wanted to write too, was one where you would follow the narrative voice anywhere.
Yeah. So I read your book electronically, so so I didn't know the end was near, right? I didn't necessarily know the end was coming, and I read the last line, and I was like, okay, I kept going, and I went back to the last line. You talked about like images versus voice. I mean, the voice throughout the book is incredible of your narrator. We'll talk about in a minute. The last image is so good. You talk about arresting. Like I kind of like, okay, let me read that over a few more times. Like, whoa, like I love that last image. It's not
Thank you.
not necessarily the most happy. We'll talk about if it optimism, pessimism, right? But it was like, whoa.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I was very torn on whether to use it or not, because some early readers thought it was very cynical. I didn't totally see it that way. I thought it was kind of mixed, right? Like there's definitely a heaviness to it, but there's also some literal light. I mean, we're kind of talking around what it is.
Right.
So you'll have to read the book to find out. But I'm glad it worked for you, because I was really 50-50 on whether to keep that line or not.
Well, yeah, you said cynical, but I feel like that goes with the voice of well, maybe of Debbie more than the narrator, but yeah. So I'm such a big fan of endings that really just resonate once you've closed the book, so to speak, and that's one of them for sure.
Thank you.
I think it was this week or so that the discourse on Twitter was, like that Drake meme where he's rushing his shoulder or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna totally mess it up, but it was something about like poets becoming novelists, novelists becoming poets.
Yes. Yeah, we're like novelists writing poetry, gross, but poets writing novels. Huh. I like it.
So which one are you?
I would say I'm a poet writing novels.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that I wrote the novel the way that I write poems, which is to not so much to outline, not to have a sense of here are the themes I want to hit on, here's the plot, here are the characters, but just finding a voice and being guided by image and by beauty and truth. And I know that all sounds kind of schmaltzy, but it's how I write poems, is just letting the process of discovery guide whatever's happening. And I wrote a whole book that way. And of course I had to do a lot of editing, because a 64,000 word novel written like a poem is going to have major plot holes. It's going to have a little too much ambiguity for readers to feel content with. It's going to have characters who aren't fleshed out enough. And lines that are just flexes and aren't doing anything for the
Mm.
craft. So I definitely had to do a ton of editing on it, but it's how the book got written.
You happen to remember a line that was a flex that was gotten rid of?
Yeah, a line that I mean it was mostly just like weird sexual commentary that was just like beating people over the head. One of them was there's a deleted scene that was actually published in Guernica recently, which is such a fun way of doing an excerpt, by the way, is rather than doing a published excerpt, doing a deleted scene. That was a lot of fun.
That is so cool.
So it was a scene in which the narrator picks up some like weirdo from Salvation, the bar that she's always frequenting, and they go back to her place, and clearly he thinks that they're gonna have sex and do a bunch of drugs, but she hands a marker and is like, let's draw each other. And so she like pulls out this roll of like the medical examination table they put on, at the doctor's office, that like crinkly, like almost parchment paper. Yeah, very, very not sexy. And they draw each other. And he actually does an amazing job like drawing. He draws on her with this marker and is actually like a really surprisingly talented artist. But she's a horrible artist. And as she's drawing him, I think she says, I drew hands like penises. I drew penises like flashlights casting rays of jizz. I do miss the flashlights casting rays of jizz. It's like I feel like I can see the image, the little squiggly lines.
Oh my God. Wow. So obviously that it still exists. Like, is that put in the metaphorical like cabinet, drawer for like later? Does that come up in another book maybe?
Well, I've now used that multiple times. Like, so I think I used it in that piece that was in Guernica, I think. And then I also used it I wrote a craft essay for LitHub about, I think my original title for the piece, it was a play on the Amy Hempel short story, In the Cemetery Where Al Jolson's Buried. I called it In the Cemetery Where My Bangers Are Buried. It has a different title now. I think it's called like Ruth Madievsky on burying her darlings in a cemetery of bangers. Yeah, and it's basically about like, whether other writers keep like a Word doc that's basically a cemetery of all the favorite lines they had to cut that weren't serving their books. And I included that line in it, plus a few others. And I interviewed some other writers and had them contribute a line from their recent books. Cool. It was fun. I think it also felt like closure, right? Like you get to these lines that kind of were dead ends that were just pretty but didn't do anything for the book. You kind of get to give them a second life.
Oh man. The book starts off All Night Pharmacy, which again came out July 11th, so we're 11 days into the launch. With the original Russian and the English translations, a Russian proverb: "With you it's good, but without you it's even better." So kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah, kind of a bitchy proverb, which is so much of the Russian language has that kind of like tongue-in-cheek sort of humor.
Kind of can't live with them, can't live without them, right? And so right early on, there's a great description. You're great with characterization. The narrator, the unnamed narrator, she's talking about her sister. How much older is Debbie than the narrator?
A couple years.
That's what I thought. 2-3 years, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. Quote: "Spending time with my sister Debbie was like buying acid off a guy you met on the bus. You never knew if it would end with you euphoric, tanning topless on a fishing boat headed for Ensenada, or coming to in a gas station bathroom, the insides of your eyes feeling as though they've been scraped out with spoons. Often it was both. The first time Debbie took me to Salvation," and Salvation is the bar that we talk about, but just such a great just like boom, like throwing you in. Here's Debbie. Here is Debbie. What was the inspiration for Debbie? If you want to share, who was the inspiration? It was kind of like an amalgam of characters, and maybe just if you could describe her a little bit, like her background.
Debbie is the unnamed narrator's older sister, just by a couple years. So when the book starts, the narrator is 18 and Debbie is about 20. And she is chaotic. She's larger than life. She is a total thrill seeker, life of the party, but also someone who is going to drag you on like a really cursed adventure that will end with you guys hooking up with all the wrong people, doing all the wrong drugs in all the wrong places. It, as the narrator says, it often leads to the deforestation of her remaining dopamine. Which is such like a line by a poet pharmacist, I think, because you got to have both of those in there. And in terms of inspiration for her, so like I said, I don't outline. And that first line, spending time with my sister Debbie, was like buying acid off a guy you met on the bus, is something that I wrote very early in the drafting process and thought, who's talking? Who's Debbie? Where are we taking the bus to? I'm just going to let her keep going. And that's how we got the characters. I basically just let the narrator just say kind of very voicey, specific, kind of highly imagistic things about the world she was inhabiting, which I was imagining as I was going. And through that, we got this character of Debbie, who, you know, is sort of a Dennis Johnson character a little bit. You know, one of these sort of semi-tragic fuck ups who's still just a lot of fun to spend time with. And who's searching for something, we don't quite know what it is, some kind of transcendence, some kind of meaning, just like the narrator, but it always gets searched for in all the wrong places.
Well, as you wrote, and I've heard you say in the interviews, like, you know, it's this idea that Debbie's like the artist and the narrator's like the canvas. I mean, you know, they're not like direct opposites, polar opposites, but there's a line that's, quote, Debbie wore her body like she owned it, which is kind of, you know, a subtle juxtaposition, right? Where it's like Debbie did, sorry, the narrator didn't, right? And she talks about, you know, what kind of, you know, walking hunched over, and, you know, quote, being a person didn't come naturally to me the way it seemed to for others. And we have, you know, early on we have this night at Salvation where the narrator meets Ronnie. Ronnie is like the guy with like all the cheesy, like, maybe not literally, all the cheesy pithy sayings in his house, right? He gets,
yeah, he's the one where his lifelong, he works in an electronics store, but his lifelong dream is to start a self-improvement video game company, which is like therapy but fun. Like he's just so earnest and too
earnest
sweet
is
for the
the
world.
word, right? How should we feel? How do you feel about Ronnie? Ronnie the boyfriend, Ronnie the
I love
future.
him. You know, I think that because of the kind of book that this is, because it's so, you know, kind of gritty and seedy, and she meets him at this like bar where all these fuck ups find refuge, I think that it would be natural to expect him to be some kind of like gross bad boyfriend, kind of nefarious character, but he's just so pure. And just loves the narrator so much, even though she doesn't deserve it, and she finds it a little revolting. You know, like she talks about how the time she's most attracted to him is when he's giving her driving lessons in some parking lot and telling her what to do. But then when she tries to bring that energy back to the bedroom, he just can't sustain it because he just loves her so much and just can't be that like kind of dark boyfriend, you know, who makes you feel a little scared. He's just too safe. And she finds that a little repulsive. You know, and he's the kind of one of the first people, if not the first person, to point out that her relationship with her sister is fucked up, and that her sister doesn't make her happy. If anything, whenever they spend time together, it ends horribly. And I think she believes him, but she kind of feels like what's the point in you even saying that? Like there's no world in which me and my sister would ever become estranged. And I think she thinks that part of the reason he doesn't get it, though she can't really articulate at the time, is that being Jewish, being the child of people who survived Soviet terror and the Holocaust, the idea of just tossing aside a family member who's not good to you just feels very foreign to her. And I think feels like, oh, such an American born thing to say, to tell me not to hang out with my sister anymore.
Yeah, Ronnie may be the first psychic or the first prophet of the book, huh?
Right? Oh, I love the idea that this like very pure man is one of the first prophets.
So you talk about salvation. Salvation's a trip. I mean, it's the bar where, like, you know, they're doing the wrong drugs in the wrong places, and there's that game they play, the wealthy patron, right?
Yeah,
like
most cursed game ever.
The most cursed game ever. It's like you know, truth or dare to the extreme, or how much, you know, the whole like, what would you do for this amount of money? And
yeah, it's basically this. I came up with this game, me and my husband, one of our friends, and we were hanging out in Boston one day where we were talking about like, you know, a very cursed bar game in which you have to like the concept is that there's a wealthy patron who's going to pay you X amount of money to do something disgusting and degrading, and what amount of money would you set your price at to do X act. And so at Salvation, this is a game that people play for fun and sometimes for real, where we have people who are so desperate for connection, for money, for drugs, for love, that, you know, they might actually do the things that are like, haha, just kidding, unless you know, from the game, if the mood strikes.
Yeah, I was so struck by like that there were almost like literally people, mostly men, right? Like just literally waiting there, like listening. Like, oh, okay, oh, you said that, like, oh, okay, we can make that happen. Like,
yeah, sold.
Yeah, sold. Seedy is the word, right? And with that though, like early on, Debbie, why not? Debbie says, you know what, you and Ronnie, your husband and wife, and we'll get some free drinks and some, free drinks and free sentimentality out of it. And from then on, Ronnie and the narrator are quote unquote married anytime they're at Salvation. And the narrator sees it as well. Ronnie's at least a stable husband, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe hoping to offset this family situation. Her father is described as their father, Debbie's, and the narrator is described as dead-eyed. The mom is into conspiracy theories, thinks that there are always people watching her. I don't think the mom, it was like, I actually wrote it down somewhere. It was page 116 or so, depending on maybe the copy, where the mom is kind of like first introduced, as in like we hear her in dialogue and all that.
Mm-hmm.
She'd been introduced in exposition. I met such a different mom with the dialogue than I was expecting. The way
Mm-hmm.
she's described, you kind of, you're like, come on, why won't you be a better mother to these kids? But also feeling for her. But when you just see her, hear her speak as a regular person, you're just like, oh man, I wonder if you could talk. And I know it's something that's probably not probably, that is absolutely indescribable, is for people to grow up with the traumas of the Holocaust, of Soviet, anti-Semitism, the
Mm-hmm.
pogroms, all that. But just about like how the mother is who she is because of what happened to her grandfather, to her family.
So the narrator's mother, she has this kaleidoscope of mental illnesses that no doctor can adequately
Hmm.
diagnose. She's very paranoid and has kind of metabolized all these stories about what her relatives went through in the Soviet Union with Soviet terror, with her grandfather being just taken by the KGB and disappeared one day, and with relatives who died in Babin Yar and in various points in the Holocaust. And even though she hasn't experienced any of these things personally, she's really internalized these stories and has this intense paranoia that any day now the US could turn and the firing squad can always be around the corner. And it's not like the QAnon anti-Semitic type conspiracy
Right.
theories that people
Right.
might be imagining. It's really a deeply traumatized, paranoid kind of conspiracy theories.
Hmm.
And it does kind of, in the beginning of the book, I think leads you to think that, she's a total failure as a mom and that there's maybe no warmth there, but she's actually very loving. She just
Hmm.
isn't capable of really functioning in society the way that she could when she was younger before the delusions took hold. And I think wants to be there for her kids, but just doesn't have the insight to know that the way that she sees the world isn't exactly how the world is.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. The grandmother is described as quote a hard woman, and she
Mm-hmm.
feels like her daughter, right, is kind of like co-opting the traumas, and it's like a betrayal.
Exactly. And that's I think a very generational thing.
Mm.
Just in general, is I think that older generations, even if you're not an immigrant, I think more often look down on therapy and
Mm.
anxiety and depression medication and why is everyone so soft these days? And I think that that's extra compounded when you have an immigrant background where it's